Vyra stood at the edge of the crystal plateau, the twin sons of Zeldar casting jagged shadows over the exile platform. Below, the chasm of Durn awaited, a deep, endless abyss into which the Forsaken were thrown, their names erased from history. A silent crowd of Zilani stood behind her, their silver eyes cold, their rigid ceremonial robes flowing in the acrid winds. The High Arbiter, draped in the golden insignia of her caste, raised a slender hand. Vyra of House Cal, you have rejected the path of dominion. You have refused the will of the ascendancy. For this, we strip you of your name, your rank, and your place among us. Vyra's throat tightened, but she held her head high. She had known this moment would come. The ascendancy ruled through war, through conquest, through the breaking of lesser civilizations. But Vyra had refused to take up arms, had spoken against the purges, had dared to advocate for peace. And for that, she had been declared anathema. You will be cast from our world, the High Arbiter continued, voice like ice. You will walk among the lesser beings of the galaxy, for you are no longer Zilani. A hush fell over the assembly as Vyra's closest kin, her father, High Commander Toller, approached. His golden warplate gleamed in the dying sunlight. He did not look at her, did not acknowledge her as his daughter. He merely placed a hand on her shoulder, the traditional gesture of severance. Go, he said, his voice devoid of emotion. Then the guards seized her. She did not resist as they led her to the waiting shuttle, its sleek black hull gleaming with the sigils of the exile fleet. Her wrists were bound in grav restraints, the weight of them pressing down like the judgment of her people. The moment she stepped aboard, the ramp hissed closed. The engines roared to life. Zeldar, her home, fell away beneath her. Vyra closed her eyes. The void awaited. The rusted blade was the kind of station where people want to disappear. Floating on the edge of neutral space, it was a haven for outlaws, bounty hunters, and smugglers, the dregs of the galactic underbelly. And now, it was Vyra's prison. The Zilani did not kill their exiles outright. They left them to fend for themselves in the vast, merciless galaxy, where survival was its own punishment. The exile ship had dumped her on this station with nothing but the clothes on her back. No credits, no weapons, no allies. She had lasted 3 days. On the 4th, a group of Bracken raiders had cornered her in a derelict storage bay, laughing at the easy prey she made. She had tried to reason with them, to use words instead of violence. They had responded with fists. And then he arrived. The human was a specter of war, broad-shouldered, clad in a battered combat rig, his face marked by the scars of a life spent on the battlefield. His name was Logan Voss, and he did not waste time with threats. One of the Brackens drew a blade. Logan shot him in the head. The others fled before they could meet the same fate. He turned to Vyra, tilting his head. You always let people use you as a punching bag. Or was today special? Vyra swallowed, touching the cut on her lip. I don't believe in violence. Logan snorted. Then you won't last long out here. He turned to leave, and something in Vyra snapped. She had spent her life following ideals that had led her to ruin. Her people had cast her aside. The galaxy saw her as weak, and now this man, this human, thought her pathetic. She would not let that stand. I want to learn, she said, voice firm. Logan paused. Learn what? How to fight. He looked her over, sizing her up like a soldier inspecting faulty gear. You sure? Because once you go down that road, there's no turning back. Vyra lifted her chin. I'm sure. A slow, dangerous grin spread across Logan's face. All right, exile. Let's get to work. Training was brutal. Logan did not coddle. He did not care that Vyra had never held a weapon, had never thrown a punch, had never felt the sting of battle scars. He made her fight. Day after day, in the shadowed depths of the rusted blade, he drilled her in the arts of survival. Hand-to-hand combat, marksmanship, tactics. He taught her how to strike, how to evade, how to kill. You want to live? He growled, shoving her to the ground after yet another failed attempt to counter his attacks. Then stop thinking like a Zilani and start thinking like someone who actually has to fight for their survival. Her hands were bruised, her muscles ached, but she did not break. She learned. And soon, she fought back. The first time Vyra killed, it was not out of rage. It was out of necessity. The Bracken Raiders had returned, but this time, they weren't looking for sport. They were looking for blood. And when Logan was outnumbered, when the fight turned against him, Vyra did not hesitate. She pulled the trigger. The plasma bolt seared through the Raider's skull, his body crumpling to the deck. The others turned on her in shock. Too late. Logan took down the rest in seconds. As the bodies cooled, Logan turned to her, nodding in approval. Not bad, Exile. Vyra stared at the smoking weapon in her hands. She had thought she would feel guilt, but there was none. There was only clarity. Her people had cast her out for refusing to fight. But now, she saw the truth. The Ascendancy ruled through fear, through oppression, through power. And if she wanted to change them, she would need to fight them on their own terms. She met Logan's gaze, fire burning in her silver eyes. I want more. He smirked. I was hoping you'd say that. The war for Zeldar had just begun. Logan watched Vyra train with quiet satisfaction. In the dim light of the rusted blade's abandoned cargo hold, she was a blur of motion, striking, dodging, countering. Gone was the timid exile who had pleaded for peace. In her place stood a warrior in the making. She had learned to wield a plasma rifle with deadly precision. She could disarm a man twice her size in seconds. And, most importantly, she no longer hesitated. She was ready. But a warrior alone meant nothing. We need an army, she said one night, her silver eyes gleaming in the station's flickering neon glow. A force strong enough to challenge the Ascendancy. Logan smirked. An army, huh? You planning to recruit mercs? Vyra shook her head. Mercenaries fight for credits, not causes. We need people who have suffered under the Ascendancy. People who have lost everything. Logan leaned back against the table, considering. Sounds like you're talking about rebels. I am. His smirk widened. Then I know just the place. The journey to Garros, 7 was rough. The planet was nothing but a desolate wasteland. The ruins of war still etched into its cracked surface. The Ascendancy had crushed a rebellion here years ago, leaving behind a population too broken to fight again. Or so they thought. As Vyra and Logan stepped into the settlement, they saw the truth. Starving civilians, battered old soldiers, and the remnants of a force that had once dared to defy the Zalani war machine. Vyra approached an old rebel leader, a grizzled man named Oren Kale, who had once commanded a fleet against the Ascendancy. You're wasting your time, Oren said, his voice rough with age and loss. The war's over. We lost. Vyra met his gaze, unwavering. You lost because you fought without knowing their weakness. But I do. Oren scoffed. And what's that? Vyra took a step closer, lowering her voice. They believe they are untouchable, that no one can stand against them. We're going to prove them wrong. Oren studied her, then glanced at Logan. And what about you, human? Why are you here? Logan folded his arms. Because I like impossible odds. Silence stretched between them. Then, slowly, Oren grinned. Maybe you're both insane, he said. But if you're serious, we still have some fight left in us. With Oren's men, Vyra's army began to take shape. They gathered weapons, repaired old ships, and trained relentlessly. Logan drilled them in guerrilla tactics, hit-and-run strikes, and sabotage, methods that would tear at the edges of the Ascendancy's power. And then, finally, it was time. Their first target, a Zalani supply outpost. The night was silent as their strike team moved through the darkness, cloaked in stolen Ascendancy armor. The guards never saw it coming. Vyra struck first. A swift knife to the throat, a plasma bolt to the skull. Her hesitation was gone. By dawn, the outpost was in flames. Its supply depots emptied, its communications severed. The Ascendancy had been struck, and Vyra knew they would strike back. The retaliation came faster than expected. Within 48 hours of the outpost's destruction, the Ascendancy responded with brutal efficiency. Patrol ships swarmed Garros, 7, searching for the ones responsible. Cities were placed under martial law, civilians were questioned at gunpoint, and suspected rebels were executed in the streets. Vyra watched it all from the safety of the rebel hideout, her fists clenched at her sides. They're scared, Logan said, standing beside her. Which means we did something right. Vyra turned to him, her silver eyes burning. This isn't fear. This is anger. They want to send a message. They always do, Oren Kale muttered from the corner, his weathered face grim. And that message is surrender or die. Logan exhaled, checking the charge on his rifle. Then we need to hit them again before they can regroup? Vyra hesitated. She had no illusions about what they were up against. The Ascendancy was an empire built on centuries of domination. One skirmish wouldn't bring them down. We need more than hit-and-run tactics, she said finally. We need a symbol. Logan frowned. You mean propaganda? I mean a reason for people to fight, Vyra said. We need to show the galaxy that the Ascendancy can be hurt, that we aren't just raiders. We are the beginning of something greater. Oren grunted. And how do you plan to do that? Vyra turned to the holomap in the center of the war room. A glowing representation of the sector flickered to life, displaying Ascendancy-controlled territories. Her eyes locked onto one target, the fortress of Vorthal, a heavily armed station, a strategic command center, and, most importantly, her father's base of operations. The plan was suicidal. Even Logan admitted as much. Storming a Zalani stronghold is one thing, he muttered, pacing in front of the assembled rebels. Storming this stronghold is madness. It isn't madness, Vyra countered. It's necessary. She pointed at the holomap, tracing the station's defensive structure. Vorthal is a symbol of Ascendancy power. It's where they coordinate military campaigns across the sector. If we take it, we cripple them. Oren crossed his arms. And what about the High Commander? You do realize that's where your father is stationed, right? Vyra's jaw tightened. I know. Logan studied her, his blue eyes sharp. And what happens when you face him? A tense silence followed. Vyra had spent years trying to make her father see reason. Now, she would meet him not as a daughter, but as an enemy. I'll do what I have to, she said at last. Logan sighed, rubbing his temple. Fine, but if this goes sideways, don't say I didn't warn you. The rebels murmured among themselves, exchanging uncertain glances. They had followed Vyra this far, but attacking a fortress? That was a different level of war. Then Oren stepped forward, a wry smirk on his scarred face. Hell, he muttered. If we're gonna die, might as well make it count. Vorthal hung in orbit like a predator waiting to strike. Its metal hull bristling with defense turrets, its docking bays patrolled by elite Zalani warriors. No one had ever breached it before. Vyra intended to be the first. They approached in a stolen Ascendancy transport, broadcasting false identification codes. The ruse wouldn't last long, but they didn't need long. The moment they passed the outer security checkpoint, Logan turned to Vyra. Last chance to back out. She met his gaze. Not a chance. He grinned. That's what I thought. Then the alarms blared. They had been detected. Move. Logan barked, raising his rifle. The rebels poured from the transport, plasma fire cutting through the air as Zalani guards rushed to intercept them. Vyra ducked behind cover, returning fire with deadly precision. She wasn't the same woman who had once pleaded for peace. She had learned. She had adapted. She had become something new. And now, the Ascendancy would learn to fear her. The battle raged through the station's corridors, explosions shaking the fortress to its core. Vyra moved through the chaos like a shadow, cutting down enemies with the cold precision of a warrior trained for war. Then she reached the command chamber. The doors slid open, revealing a vast, circular hall lined with towering hollow displays. And standing at its center, clad in gold-trimmed war armor, High Commander Toller, her father. He turned slowly, his silver eyes settling on her. There was no shock in his gaze, no anger, only the deep, solemn weight of inevitability. So, he said, you have returned. Vyra tightened her grip on her rifle. I never wanted this war. But you started it. No, she said, her voice unwavering. You did, when you exiled me. Toller exhaled, as if weary. You were a child, clinging to naive ideals. Now I see what you have become. She stepped closer. And what is that? His expression was unreadable. A disappointment, The words struck deeper than she expected, but she did not falter. "I'm here to end this," she said. "Surrender the station. Call off the war." Toller's lips curved into something resembling amusement. "You think I fear you? You should." The air between them was charged with unspoken history. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, Toller unsheathed his energy blade. "If you want my surrender," he said, leveling the weapon at her heart, "you will have to take it." Vyra exhaled. She had known, deep down, that it would come to this. There would be no peace, only war. And this time, she would not back down. She raised her weapon and charged. Vyra's heart pounded as she sprinted forward, her plasma rifle raised. But before she could fire, Toller moved. Faster than she expected. His energy blade sliced through the air, forcing her to twist aside. The heat from the weapon seared past her armor, close enough to scorch the fabric. She dropped to one knee, firing a burst of plasma at his chest. Toller deflected the shots with inhuman precision, his blade absorbing the energy before it could touch him. "You have learned to fight," he admitted, circling her like a predator. "But you are still reckless." Vyra gritted her teeth. She had fought soldiers, mercenaries, assassins, but none of them were him. Toller was not just any warrior. He was High Commander of the Ascendancy. He had trained Zilani elites, crushed planetary uprisings, and survived countless battles. This was a duel she could not afford to lose. She switched tactics, darting backward and weaving between the towering hollow displays that projected the burning sectors of Ascendancy space. She needed to create distance, needed time to think. Toller advanced. "You never understood, Vyra," he said, voice calm. "Peace is an illusion. The strong conquer, and the weak submit. That is the truth of the galaxy." She gripped her rifle tighter. "No, that's the lie they made you believe." She aimed low, firing at his legs. He dodged, but that was what she wanted. The moment his balance shifted, she lunged, bringing up a compact vibroblade she had hidden on her thigh. Toller barely managed to parry in time. Their blades locked, the crackling hum of energy vibrating through the air. "You cannot win," he said. Vyra stared into his silver eyes. "Watch me." With a surge of strength, she kicked him in the chest. He staggered back, just enough for her to twist away and fire again, this time aiming at the console behind him. The control panel exploded in a shower of sparks, and suddenly the station's alarms howled in protest. Red lights flashed. Self-destruct sequence initiated. Toller's expression darkened. "What have you done?" Vyra took a steady breath. "What you taught me to do, father." She stepped back. "I made a choice." Across the station, Logan and the rebels fought their way toward the extraction point as the fortress trembled beneath their feet. Logan ducked behind cover, firing into a squad of Zilani enforcers. "Vyra, if you're alive, now's a great time to get the hell out of there." Static crackled in his earpiece before her voice came through. "I'm on my way." He exhaled in relief. "About damn time." Vyra sprinted through the corridors, her father's voice still echoing in her mind. But she didn't stop. She had chosen her path, and there was no turning back. Vyra sprinted through the crumbling corridors of Vorthal as the station tore itself apart. Sirens howled. Plasma conduits ruptured, spewing superheated vapor into the air. The deck beneath her feet trembled with each explosion. Behind her, High Commander Toller remained standing, his golden warplate now coated in dust and flickering embers. He had made no attempt to follow her. "You will never escape what you are," his voice carried over the chaos, cold and unwavering. Vyra didn't turn back. She had already escaped. The docking bay was just ahead. Logan and the rebels had already secured a transport, its engines roaring to life. "Vyra!" Logan shouted from the open ramp, exchanging fire with Zilani guards as they poured into the hangar. "Move your ass." Vyra ducked beneath a stray bolt, diving forward as the force of an explosion behind her sent a shockwave rippling through the station. The blast hurled her off her feet. She hit the ramp hard, skidding forward as Logan grabbed her by the arm, yanking her inside. The moment she was aboard, the ship lurched upward, thrusters burning hot as it lifted off. Through the viewport, She saw the fortress of Vorthal convulsing in its death throes. Toller had not evacuated. He had chosen to die with his command. Vyra watched as the explosion consumed him. A part of her wanted to feel grief, but all she felt was cold. The transport slipped into hyperspace, leaving the wreckage of Vorthal behind. The rebels cheered. For the first time in history, the Ascendancy had lost a major stronghold. A symbol of their invincibility had crumbled. But Vyra felt no triumph. Logan sat across from her, watching her carefully. "You okay?" She met his gaze, searching for an answer. Her father was dead. The man who had raised her. The man who had cast her out. The man who had taught her to fight, even as he denied her the right to stand beside him. And now, he was gone. Vyra exhaled slowly. "I don't know." Logan nodded as if he understood. "That's the price of war." She clenched her fists. "This isn't over." Logan smirked. "Damn right it's not." The destruction of Vorthal had sent a message across the galaxy. The Ascendancy was not unbreakable, and Vyra was just getting started. News of the Ascendancy's defeat at Vorthal spread like wildfire. Across the outer systems, resistance groups that had long been crushed under Zolani rule suddenly saw hope. Smuggler networks whispered of a rogue warrior who had defied her own people and lived to tell the tale. Even the warlords of the neutral zones, opportunists who thrived in chaos, began taking interest. But hope was a dangerous thing. It made people reckless, and it made the Ascendancy furious. The rebel fleet, still small but growing, had barely escaped Vorthal before Ascendancy reinforcements arrived. Now, hidden deep within the debris fields of the Oblivion Expanse, they licked their wounds and prepared for the inevitable counterattack. Inside the war room of the Iron Fang, the rebels' stolen warship, a holographic display flickered with intelligence reports. Logan, arms crossed, studied the shifting fleet movements of the Ascendancy. "They're regrouping faster than I expected," he muttered. "They just lost a major stronghold, but instead of retreating, they're consolidating forces along the border worlds. That's not just damage control. That's preparation for a war." Vyra stood at his side, her silver eyes cold. "Then we hit them again before they're ready." Oren Kale let out a rough laugh from the corner. "Damn, girl. You don't waste time, do you?" "This is our only chance," Vyra insisted. "We struck first, and they weren't prepared. If we let them regain their footing, they'll hunt us down system by system until nothing is left." Logan glanced at her. "You're talking about open war? We're already at war." The room fell into silence. Oren sighed, rubbing his temple. "Well, if we're doing this, we need a bigger fleet. We barely have enough firepower to hold a single engagement, let alone a sustained conflict." Vyra turned back to the display. There were only a handful of places in the sector where they could find the kind of firepower they needed, and one of them was Drask's Maw. Drask's Maw was a lawless graveyard of derelict ships and shattered asteroids, an outlaw haven where only the ruthless survived. Pirates, slavers, and mercenaries carved out their own brutal empires among the wreckage, trading in weapons, technology, and blood. At its center sat Warlord Kodrak, the self-proclaimed ruler of the Maw and the commander of a fleet large enough to rival the Ascendancy itself. If Vyra wanted an army, she would have to convince him to fight. The Iron Fang touched down on a battle-scarred station deep within the Maw. Vyra, Logan, and Oren stepped onto the docking bay, met immediately by a squad of Kodrak's enforcers. Hulking brutes clad in scavenged armor, their weapons humming with barely restrained power. "You got 5 minutes," one of them growled. "Say something worth hearing, or we throw you out the airlock." Vyra stepped forward, meeting his gaze without fear. "Tell Kodrak that I bring war to the Ascendancy, and if he wants to rule more than this scrap heap, he'll want to listen." The enforcer studied her, then smirked. "Brave words. Let's see if you survive saying them to his face." Warlord Kodrak was everything the stories claimed. Massive, scarred, and utterly merciless. He lounged on a throne of salvaged starship hulls, watching Vyra with curiosity. "You want my fleet?" His voice was deep, laced with amusement. "Why should I waste my ships fighting your war?" "Because it's not my war," Vyra said. "It's yours." Kodrak raised a brow. "The Ascendancy is coming," she continued. You may control the Maw now, but once they finish crushing the rebellion, they'll come for you next. They don't tolerate rivals. Kodrak leaned forward. And if I help you, what do I get? Vyra met his gaze. When we win, the Maw becomes yours, officially. No more hiding. No more dealing in shadows. You become more than a warlord. You become a ruler. Kodrak studied her for a long moment. Then, slowly, he grinned. I like you, Exile. He leaned back. Fine. You have a fleet. But if you lose, I'll carve your bones into my throne. Vyra allowed herself the smallest of smirks. Then let's make sure we don't lose. The war was no longer a whisper in the shadows. It was a roaring inferno. With Warlord Kodrak's fleet added to their forces, the rebellion had transformed from a scattered resistance into a true military power. Hundreds of ships, stolen ascendancy cruisers, retrofitted pirate vessels, and heavily armed mercenary frigates now flew under Vyra's banner. The galaxy was watching. The ascendancy was moving, and war was inevitable. The Ironfang sat in the heart of the rebel fleet, surrounded by the might of those who had once been discarded by the galaxy. Outlaws, exiles, and the forgotten. In the war room, Vyra stood at the head of the strategy table, flanked by Logan, Kale, and Kodrak. A holographic projection of ascendancy-controlled space shimmered before them. Their response will be swift, Oren said, studying the projected fleet movements. They won't just try to crush us. They'll make an example of us. They already tried that, Logan said, arms crossed. Didn't work. Kodrak chuckled, his deep voice like grinding metal. I've fought the ascendancy before. They rely on fear to keep the lesser races in line. When that fear crumbles, so does their control. Vyra nodded. Then we need to take the next step. We need a true victory. Something the entire galaxy will see. She reached out, highlighting a single glowing point on the holomap. Zereth Prime. A world at the heart of ascendancy space. A massive supply hub and tactical command center. Taking it would be more than a raid. It would be an invasion. Oren exhaled. That's bold. Kodrak grinned. That's madness. I like it. Logan glanced at Vyra. You sure about this? Vyra met his gaze. She had never been more sure of anything in her life. We take Zereth Prime, she said, and the galaxy will know that the ascendancy is not invincible. Silence fell over the room. Then, one by one, they nodded. The battle for Zereth Prime had begun. The rebel fleet dropped out of hyperspace like a tidal wave of fire and steel. Alarms screamed across ascendancy-controlled space as hundreds of ships surged towards Zereth Prime's orbital defenses. Turrets turned, capital ships deployed fighters, and the entire planet went into full lockdown. The Ascendancy had not expected an attack this deep into their territory. Vyra intended to use that to her advantage. Shields up, Logan barked over the comms, gripping the controls of the Ironfang. All squadrons, stay tight. From the viewport, Vyra watched as their forces clashed with the Ascendancy fleet. Energy beams and missile barrages turned the darkness of space into a violent storm of light. Fighter squadrons weaved through debris, cutting down enemy craft. Explosions rippled across the void as ships on both sides burned. Then, the ground assault began. Dropships hurtled through the atmosphere, evading anti-air defenses as they descended onto the surface of Zereth Prime. Vyra and Logan were among them. The Ironfang's hull shuddered as their transport broke through the clouds, revealing a sprawling Ascendancy stronghold below. Towering spires, massive weapon platforms, and thousands of enemy troops mobilizing for war. Vyra checked her weapon. Logan smirked. Ready for hell? Vyra exhaled. Born for it. The dropship doors slammed open, and the battle for Zereth Prime began. The landing was brutal. Explosions rocked the battlefield as rebel forces stormed the city-sized fortress at the planet's core. Plasma fire painted the sky in streaks of red and blue. The ground trembled as heavy war mechs clashed in the streets, their metal frames crushing everything in their path. Vyra and Logan led the charge. She moved like a ghost between the wreckage, her rifle cutting down enemy after enemy. Logan fought beside her, his shots precise, his movements calculated. They had fought together long enough to anticipate each other's actions without speaking. And still, the Ascendancy fought back with relentless fury. Through the chaos, Vyra spotted the central command tower, the heart of the stronghold. "If we take that tower, we control the entire city," she called to Logan. "Then let's not waste time," he shot back. They pushed forward, carving a path through enemy lines, their soldiers rallying behind them. Explosions thundered overhead as the battle raged both on land and in orbit. And then, a voice cut through the chaos. A transmission, broadcasting across all channels. A voice Vyra thought she would never hear again. "This is High Commander Toller. All forces, regroup and prepare for counteroffensive." Vyra froze. Toller was alive, and he was coming for her. Vyra's breath caught in her throat. Her father was alive. For a moment, the battlefield around her blurred. The sounds of gunfire, the shouts of soldiers, the roaring of distant explosions all faded into nothing but the cold weight of realization pressing down on her chest. Toller had survived the destruction of Vorthal, and now he was coming to finish what she had started. "Vyra!" Logan's voice snapped her back to the present. He grabbed her shoulder, shoving her behind cover as a blast of plasma fire rained down where she had just been standing. "Focus!" She sucked in a breath, forcing herself to push away the storm of emotions. This wasn't over, not yet. She activated her comms. "All units report. The Ascendancy is regrouping. We need to take the command tower now before they get the chance to counterattack." Oren's voice crackled through the channel. "Easier said than done, kid. They just dropped in heavy reinforcements. We're getting torn apart out here." From the top of a ruined transport, Vyra caught sight of Ascendancy war mechs advancing across the battlefield. Towering machines of destruction, their energy cannons cutting through rebel forces like a blade through flesh. Then, through the smoke, she saw them. Toller's personal guard, a legion of Zalani warriors clad in dark battle armor, moving with precision and ruthlessness. And at their center, marching through the chaos as if it were nothing more than an inconvenience, was High Commander Toller himself. He was alive, and he was coming for her. "Vyra, we need to fall back." Logan yelled over the comms, cutting down an enemy soldier as he moved toward her. "We don't have the firepower to hold this position." Vyra's mind raced. The command tower was right there, less than 100 meters away. If they could just push through, they could override the planetary defenses and turn the tide of battle. But now, with her father leading the counteroffensive, their forces were being slaughtered. "Negative," she said, her voice sharp. "We hold the line." Logan stared at her. "Vyra, I know what you're thinking, but this isn't just about him." She met his gaze, something unspoken passing between them. It never was. Then she stood, firing her rifle as she sprinted toward the tower. Logan cursed under his breath before following her. The battle became a blur of fire and blood. Vyra fought like a woman possessed, every step bringing her closer to the tower, closer to the end. And then, he was there. Toller stepped into her path, his dark cloak billowing in the wind, his energy blade humming to life. His silver eyes locked onto hers. "You should have stayed in exile," he said. Vyra raised her weapon, her heart hammering. "You should have listened to me." Silence. Then, with a flick of his wrist, Toller charged. Vyra barely had time to react. She threw herself backward as Toller's energy blade sliced through the air where her throat had been a second before. Sparks flew as his weapon carved into the metal floor. He was faster than before, stronger, unrelenting. Vyra barely managed to parry with her vibroblade, the force of his attack sending a numbing shock through her arm. She had fought many warriors, but this was Toller, the man who had trained her, the man who had once been her father. "You've become strong," Toller said, his strikes relentless. "But you still hesitate." Vyra gritted her teeth. "Not anymore." She ducked beneath his next attack, driving her knee into his ribs before slamming the hilt of her blade into his helmet. The impact sent him staggering, and she followed up with a quick plasma shot to his shoulder. The blast sent him skidding backward, his armor smoking. For the first time, Toller hesitated. Vyra straightened, breathing heavily. "This war ends today." Toller exhaled, rolling his shoulder. "You are right about one thing, Vyra. His blade ignited again. It does. Then he lunged. Vyra met him head-on. Their blades clashed in a dance of speed, power, and precision. Sparks rained down as steel met energy, as two warriors, father and daughter, fought for the fate of a galaxy. Logan and the rebels pushed toward the command tower as the battle raged around them, their forces barely holding the line. Oren's voice crackled through the comms. Vyra, whatever you're doing, do it fast. We're running out of time. Vyra blocked out the noise, focusing only on Toller. Their fight had no words, only movement, only fury, only the raw, unspoken history between them. Then, a single opening. Vyra twisted beneath his guard, her blade slamming into his side. Toller gasped as the energy crackled through his armor. His eyes widened, not with pain, but with something like acceptance. Vyra's breath caught. For a single moment, she saw the man he had once been. The father who had trained her. The father who had cast her out. You have won, Toller whispered, staggering. Do not waste it. Then, he collapsed. Silence. Vyra stared at his motionless form, her hands trembling. She had done it. She had won. But why did it feel like she had lost? Logan's voice brought her back. Vyra, we need to move. The tower is ours. She forced herself to step away from Toller's fallen form, her legs feeling like lead. The command tower was in rebel hands. The planetary defenses were disabled, and the Ascendancy fleet was falling back. They had done it. They had taken Zereth Prime. The galaxy would never be the same. But as Vyra looked up at the burning skies, she knew one thing for certain. This war was far from over. It was only just beginning. Zereth Prime had fallen. The rebel banners now flew over the command tower, and the once mighty Ascendancy fortress lay in ruins. Smoke curled from the wreckage of war mechs and shattered starships. The last of the enemy forces had either surrendered or been driven from the battlefield. And yet, the victory felt hollow. Vyra stood atop the balcony of the captured stronghold, overlooking the battlefield below. The rebels were cheering, embracing, reveling in their impossible triumph. But she felt none of their joy. At her feet, Toller lay dying. Her father, the man who had exiled her, the man who had hunted her across the stars, now gasped for breath as his blood pooled around him. Vyra knelt beside him. You did well, he rasped, his silver eyes dulling. You became what I always feared you would. Vyra swallowed. And what was that? His lips curled in a faint smile. A leader. She clenched her fists. This didn't have to happen. It was always going to happen, he said. The moment you refused to bend, the moment you chose your own path, you sealed this fate for both of us. Vyra's throat tightened. Despite everything, a part of her had never stopped wanting his approval. Toller's breathing slowed. He looked past her, into the storm-ridden sky. Rule well, he whispered, or you will become me. Then his body stilled, and High Commander Toller of the Ascendancy was no more. The galaxy reacted swiftly to the fall of Zereth Prime. Some planets rebelled, emboldened by the uprising. Others tightened their grip, afraid of what would come next. Warlords and crime syndicates watched with greedy anticipation, eager to carve up the remnants of power. And at the center of it all stood Vyra, the woman who had been cast out, the woman who had returned in fire and fury. Logan approached her in the war room, arms crossed. So what now, Commander? She looked at him, exhaustion heavy in her bones. We prepare. He raised a brow. For what? Vyra exhaled. The Ascendancy is wounded, but they're not dead. Their fleets still control half the galaxy. Their rulers will never accept defeat. This war is far from over. Oren grunted. And what about us? We just became the biggest threat in the sector. Every power in the galaxy will be looking at us now, some wanting to join, others wanting to erase us. Vyra met his gaze, then turned to the holographic map of the sector. Planets burned. Borders shifted. War loomed on every front. We build, she said. We fight. She looked out the viewport, where the rebel fleet gathered in the void. Thousands who had once been powerless, now standing under a new banner. Her banner. We take the galaxy. Across the stars, The echoes of revolution spread. The ascendancy vowed vengeance. New alliances formed. New enemies lurked in the shadows. And at the center of it all, Vyra stood. A warrior forged in exile, now leading an empire of the Forsaken. She had won the battle. But the war for the future had just begun.